Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk different types of regimes. Now, we're not talking about government here. Government is part of a regime, and the ability of government to have sovereignty, to use power, to try to be legitimate to its people, and then to have the actual authority to rule over them. Now, what we're talking about here is we're talking about a regime. And a regime is bigger. A regime is a system of government existing for a length of time. So it's not like a certain political party running the government or a certain leader running the government for a long time. It's a whole systemic thing. And usually the systems are between a democratic government and a authoritarian government. So we have this whole setup of a state. It has government, population, territory, sovereignty, and we focus in on government. And when there's a political system over a length of time, it is known as a regime. So we have democratic regimes where the population provides that push to make sure government does what needs to happen. And we have authoritarian regimes. This is where the government is run by a person or a group of people, and they're the ones that are making decisions, usually to benefit themselves. Okay. So, an authoritarian government is a type of government where a single person or small group exercise power over the state. Here we're talking about your China, North Korea, Syria, Russia. Those are the common ones. Okay. The term. This is, by the way, a regime spectrum, and you have democratic governments that are more free. These are direct democracies, representative democracies, and constitutional monarchies. When we're talking about authoritarian governments, we talk about dictatorship, we talk about monarchy, we talk about oligarchy, which is groups of people that are dictators, and we talk about theocracies, basically a government that is run by a religious decree. All right. So, authoritarian governments are going to be often known by these kinds of names. Not all authoritarian governments, though, are hated. So, when Vladimir Putin was on the scene for about 10 years, he was really super popular in Russia. Still is somewhat popular now. Look at the media, he still has like a over 60% approval rating. Queen Elizabeth I, of course, was known as being really super vengeful. You did not cross her, but she loved her people, and well, for the most part, the people loved her. This is Sheikh Maktoum, Mohammed Maktoum. He is the crown prince of Dubai. His people absolutely adore him, but he is definitely a dictatorial ruler. You cannot go against his government. And by the way, you know, they're people. They're crazy and they're nuts, but authoritarians can become off through propaganda as like your ordinary little family. This has an authoritarian in the picture, probably one of the worst in the world, and that person is Bashar al-Assad, who is the dictator of Syria, killed 500,000 people um, in a small civil war during the early 20 teens. Okay. Now, when we go to the other side of the spectrum, people think democracy is ruled by the people. This is a misnomer. The people have a lot of influence with how government is ran, but understand, if you have rule by the people and one group of people simply get out there and oppress the other group of people, that's not a democracy. That's tyranny of the majority. So, what we're going to do is just redefine what democracy is. Democracy is where government officials are chosen by free and fair elections with constitutional limits on state power. Look, in a democracy, the government cannot have power just to do whatever the heck it wants. There actually has to be individual rights and liberties of its citizens. All right. So let's take a look at the difference between authoritarian and democratic regimes. Uh, Difference number one that should be coming right off the bat is the concept of rule of law. Super important. It's that laws apply to everybody in society. Members of government can't get out of being held accountable for the law. If you have a rule of law, you have a much more democratic country. Authoritarians are run by law, ruled by law. Essentially, the government just jumps in and says, I'm going to decide how the law is applied and to whom it can be applied. And there's going to be exceptions because the authoritarian is going to exempt themselves and their friends. Number two, media. A democracy is going to have free media that's going to have access to what's going on in government. In an authoritarian regime, the government pretty much influences or controls what actually happens within media. Elections, free and fair elections, if they're in a democracy, they are free, fair, and consistent. In an authoritarian regime, they hold elections all the time, but they aren't necessarily free at all, or the government simply manipulates them for an outcome, as we'll see with a country like Iran. Transparency, this is where people not only observe, but actually are involved in the process of governance. Okay. So if a government is transparent, you're talking about a democratic regime. Authoritarians don't want your input, they don't want you to see what's going on. So you're not going to have nearly the government transparency in a authoritarian regime. And then participation. Obviously, in a democracy, people are actually participating in governance and protest and rules and laws and all these kinds of things. And then in an authoritarian government, you might have limited participation by the people. It might be like chosen participation, coerced or forced participation, but mainly it's to the will of the authoritarian. You can have transitions of governments from democratic to authoritarian. They happen actually more than you might think. What brings about the transition to a more authoritarian style regime? Well, if you have less fair or competitive elections, if you have elections that are delayed or canceled, anytime somebody says we should delay or cancel an election, that's really a red flag that the democracy is starting to lose some of its hold and focus. Censoring media on a stronger, stricter level, calling the media evil or an enemy or an opposition. The media is there to try to transfer information to voters so they can make decisions about how government is run. Limiting any kind of opposition groups, political parties. And finally, if you have a single group or party that actually dominates the political system, that's not really a democratic society. That's more sliding towards authoritarianism. The reverse can also be true when governments go from being more authoritarian towards democracy. This is known as democratization. It's moving from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. So, what happens is you start to allow more free, fair, and most importantly, consistent elections. You hold them at regular intervals so people have a chance to have their voices heard in government. You engage in peaceful transfers of power. If you lose and you walk away. You may be able to fight another day, but politically, it's super important that if you lose an election, you don't take up arms, you're not engaged in any acts of violence or coercion. You simply walk away. That's what happens in a democratized country. Of course, you allow freer media, they have more access to government and what goes on. You have what are known as pluralistic political parties. Pluralism is the idea that society has all kinds of different people with different ideas, and that those ideas are allowed to transfer into potentially government policy. Okay. When a country has more pluralistic political parties, that means more ideas are transferred. That's greater sense of democracy, greater rule of law, so that you have everybody starts being held accountable to the actual law. You follow what the law says, and it doesn't matter if you're an elite, a politician, you're still held accountable. Finally, civil liberties. And civil liberties are basic freedoms that a person gets within a country. Even and these freedoms are usually protected not only from other people, but they're protected from the government as well. When you have more civil liberties, you have more democratization. So you have different types of, direct democracy is when people vote directly on laws. Representative democracy is when people vote in representatives that are going to enact the laws. And then you have the constitutional monarchy. This is when, if you do have some kind of monarch, that they have to follow a written constitution or a set of laws like that. The UK, a lot of countries like Norway, Spain, they all have monarchs, but they're basically symbolic figureheads, don't have any political power. Anarchy is much rarer. Um, Anarchy is obviously a lack of government. There have been attempts to create some kind of pseudo anarchist societies. They often usually fail because they are either chaotic or end up being super, super poor. Okay. Here's our regime spectrum if you want to look around the world at free, partly free, and not free countries. And we'll be talking about um, Freedom House, which actually measures whether a country is more free or less free. Free countries are countries like Scandinavian countries, Japan, the UK, Taiwan, France, South Korea, the United States, Poland, um, Israel. These are considered democratic, more free. You, as the United States, is obviously not way over here. Okay. The UK is considered a free country with strong democratic consolidation, no real threat of turning authoritarian. Partly free countries, you got like your Indonesia, India, Philippines, Singapore, Nigeria, and Mexico are both considered partly free. Mexico over time is becoming more free. A lot of it has to do with just violence and corruption. That's the main thing that's preventing Mexico to become more free. Journalists like the free media, yes, you have, free media in Mexico, but you also can really get killed for it. It's one of the worst places to be a journalist in the world is Mexico. You start reporting on drug cartels, you might end up dead. Nigeria is kind of slipping more backwards. A lot of people are looking at democracy, which has been there since 1999, saying it's not making my life a whole lot better. So I'd rather have stability and maybe even some more dictatorial power, which has a history of pre 1999. Obviously, Russia, Iran, and China are dictatorial. Russia and China are getting more dictatorial, meaning less free, more authoritarian. Iran's not like kind of stagnant. It doesn't. There's no indication it's going to become more democratic really at all. Thailand is an example of a country that's perfectly safe to visit, but understand that you're same with the United Arab Emirates, where Dubai or Abu Dhabi is located. Go there. It's usually perfectly safe, stable countries. Everybody's really nice. But if you speak out against the government or you break the rules, you can get imprisoned or worse. Uh, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Syria, North Korea, extremely repressive, anti democratic, very authoritarian societies. Right? So we have different regimes, which remember are political systems over a length of time. It's bigger than government. It is like a systemic thing. And you have democracies, you have authoritarian, and get to really understand the differences between the two.